G'day, I'm Owen. You've joined the pub test, and in this one we are continuing the Jack the Ripper saga, and we are looking primarily at what is known as the Polish Jew theory. Now, you might remember from the last video in the Jack the Ripper series, we looked at the DNA, because it's been said that there was a bloke matched, Aaron Kosminski. So therefore this case is solved. We'll go and have a look at that video if you haven't done so yet, then come back to this one. But why we're not just looking at Aaron Kosminski in this video is because the Polish Jew theory is quite intertwined with a few suspects. So could any of these people have been Jack the Ripper? Well, let's put it to the pub test. To begin with, let's consider the history and why it became known as the Polish Jew theory. Now, some of these people probably weren't from Poland, but in Poland around 1880, there was a bit of religious persecution happening to the Jewish population there. Now, a big Jewish population had actually established itself in Poland, but there was also a bit of a financial pressure in that country at the time too. So many Jewish people emigrated to England, particularly to London, and many of them settled in the East End. Now, it's said that from 1880 to 1914, the beginning of World War I, about 150,000 Jewish people emigrated to the East End of London. So by 1888, when the Jack the Ripper saga was in play, there would have already been quite the established Jewish community in that Whitechapel area. And yet the term Polish Jew then referred to anybody who came from Eastern Europe, sometimes even Russia. If you had a strange name, in the sense that if an English person found it hard to pronounce or to understand, and you spoke a different dialect, like you didn't speak English very well, well, you became known as a Polish Jew because they were the predominant immigrating people. But as always, this created a bit of an issue because the people living in the East End of London were seeing these foreigners coming in and maybe taking away the jobs that they could have. And this is important as we go through this theory too. There was a particular plan for these Jewish immigrants coming into the East End because the Jewish community did not want to look like they were a burden on society. In fact, they had to be the total opposite, because if they started taking the welfare or ending up all in workhouses and on the streets, well, this immigration would get cut off. The government would say, I think we've got enough of you now. You're not really helping society. You're becoming a hindrance. So, the door is now closed. So what the Jewish community did was that if they had someone come over and perhaps they fell down on their luck or couldn't get work, they would make sure that that person had some type of employment. And they had their own lodging houses, for want of a better word, where if you didn't quite have the money, you could work in one of these shops. Often it was a shoemaker or a tailor. Now, because you weren't qualified, the gear you probably made, either as a bootmaker or a tailor, may not have been the highest standard, so they would sell those garments at street markets for a much reduced price. Now, these ones working in that industry wouldn't make a lot of money, if hardly anything at all, really, but it kept them off the welfare books. And so it would look like all these immigrants were gainfully employed. And it's possible, therefore, they also didn't want any criminals to be known amongst the Jewish community, because that too may have closed the door to this immigration. But I will make this point. How bad were the conditions you would have to be in to uproot your entire family, go to another country, and live in the East End of London at the time, which was jam-packed with people, and the conditions weren't great? It horrifies the mind to think of the conditions they were living in before they came over. But that's a topic for another time. But many of these immigrants then, if they were being a cobbler, a shoe repairer, well, they would wear a leather apron. And the leather apron is important in the Jack the Ripper saga because the perpetrator was known as Leather Apron for a long time. In fact, all the way up until the double event with Catherine Eddowes. It was only after that, those 4 canonical crimes had occurred, did the name Jack the Ripper actually hit the media because of the letters coming in. And many women on the street who were being accosted were saying it's a Polish Jew person wearing a leather apron. So we would say that would make them very easy to find, except, and this sometimes gets missed, a leather apron being worn by someone working back in those days was ubiquitous. They were everywhere. It wasn't just cobblers. It wasn't just Polish Jewish people. In fact, it's even said, and I cannot find this for sure, so if you know those details out there, put it down in comments, but I believe it said that Charles Lechmere turned up to the inquest that he attended wearing a leather apron. So even Carmen wore leather aprons. So when the media said capture leather apron, when you look at the picture that they put in the paper, it didn't show an English person. It did show this Polish, Jewish, sinister looking person. And that is also important because we will get back to the descriptions or depictions, I should say, of some of these suspects. But as we know, quite a lot of women had been attacked in the Whitechapel area well before the canonical crimes began. But it was after the first 2 that the press really blew this up and said the police are useless, they got to do something. And as mentioned, they ran this capture leather apron. And so Sergeant Thick, he was the main man on the beat. He said, I know where to go pick him up. And off he goes. Now, we have covered this before in the channel, but I'm adding some more detail here. So he goes to the home of John Pizer. And the interaction they have is that Sergeant Thick goes, you know why I'm here. And Pizer's like, oh, mate, no idea. He goes, I know your leather apron. Well, who was John Pizer? Now, John Pizer was not just a cobbler. And there is I think it's a cordweiner is the expression. But there is a difference. A bootmaker was a step up a cobbler. Because a cobbler back in those days only had the authority or licensing to repair shoes, not make them. So John Pizer was an actual boot maker. He'd done the whole trade. Yet he wasn't of great character. He had attacked a fellow shoemaker over some money, and he was known to harass women on the street, assault them as well. So this bloke was not a high-class individual. But I could just imagine the conversation that Pizer has with Sergeant Thick when Sergeant Thick knocks on the door and says, you know why I'm here. And Pizer goes, mate, I got no idea. He goes, I know your leather apron. Come with me. Now, Pizer either had nothing else to do or was rather intrigued, but regardless, he goes off with Sergeant Thick back to the police station. You see, Sergeant Thick had said all along, this bloke is known all around Whitechapel as Leather Apron. So he's the man. But Pizer alibis out very quickly. And remembering, Pizer would classify as the quintessential Polish Jewish immigrant. But because he had an alibi, well then Sergeant Thick starts backing up the track a little, going, well, most people know him as Leather Apron. But then later on, Sergeant Thick totally changes his tune and says, look, I never believed he could have been the perpetrator anyway. And Pizer had a bit to say at this coroner's inquest, and the coroner had to cut him off. And he said, look, I only gave you this platform so that you could actually prove that you were innocent, so that people didn't think that we were still suspecting you. So thank you for your comments, but you can go now. Now, Sergeant Thick actually walks John Pizer back to his house, which may seem a bit strange, except I would say this. It was at the time when social media wasn't around, and it would take a little while for information to spread, at least a day when the newspapers came out. And if someone had seen Pizer, they may have thought he's this leather apron and we're going to go touch him up or maybe do worse to him. But by the policeman walking him back home quite proudly to his house would probably tell everybody that this has been addressed and there's nothing to see here. But now here is the odd thing. John Pizer, when he gets back home, he's celebrated as a hero amongst his local community. And he goes, mate, I don't know why they thought I was leather apron. I haven't worked for 2 years. I haven't worn a leather apron for 2 years. And no one has ever called me leather apron. So I don't know what they were going on about. Well, the interest then in finding this leather apron basically disappears. But the interest the police have in the Polish Jewish theory doesn't. And this is where we go to the McNaghten memoranda. Now, I have gone to town previously about Melville McNaghten and particularly this memoranda, but this is mellowed a little bit in regards to this, because memoranda sounds like this was a really important document. Like you've spent a lot of time working this out. But we know them now today as memos. And if you work in a big business, how many memos do you get and what's the purpose of the memo? Well, it's to keep everybody in the company on the same page, so you all sing from the same hymn sheet. And what happened here was a bloke, Thomas Cutbush, had been arrested, and a new newspaper, a brand newie, had just come out, and they wanted to get some eyes on their work, so they gave a startling claim that Thomas Cutbush was Jack the Ripper. And there had been a prominent policeman who was related to this particular suspect. But they say that's why Melville McNaghten wrote this, but I would actually say no. I could imagine him sitting in the office, seeing the splash of the paper, going, oh no, not this again. So what we're going to do is just cut it off. So I'm going to send a memo out to the police, because it was not a public document. This was an internal message just saying, look, there's 3 other suspects who are way more credible than this bloke. So he says, Montague Druitt. He's my personal pick. And then there's Aaron Kosminski. And another bloke, Michael Ostrog. Now, I have to have a sidebar here and just mention that of all the videos I've done on Jack the Ripper, the 2 that have intrigued me the most, or at least made me chuckle, are Alfred Blanchard and Michael Ostrog. And why McNaghten included him on this memoranda is quite funny indeed. And you might want to go check out that video if you're just looking for a bit of light-hearted humour. But interestingly, McNaghten got details wrong about all 3 of the suspects he named. He got Druitt's occupation wrong. He got some Kosminski details wrong, as we're going to go through, and definitely, because he called Ostrog a Polish Jew, but he was Russian. But as I said before, maybe that was just the general term that was used for all these people. But Ostrog definitely could not have been Jack the Ripper. Now, as I said, McNaghten made mistakes about Kosminski, but as I'm stating here, that's just not really relevant. But what is the book written by Robert Anderson. I think it was entitled The Lighter Side of My Public Life. But now he was the police commissioner, or at least the head policeman during the Jack the Ripper crimes, though he had taken sick leave and only came back later. But he had Donald Swanson in as the man in charge of the investigation, so anything to do with Jack the Ripper went across Swanson's desk. Now, he made claim that Jack the Ripper was safely caged in an asylum. And then he went further on to state in this book, where he just touches on the Jack the Ripper saga. And to quote, "I will merely add that the only person who ever had a good view of the murderer unhesitatingly identified the suspect the instant he was confronted with him. In saying that he was a Polish Jew, I am merely stating a definitely ascertained fact." Now, who was that person who saw him? We will move towards that shortly. But one of Anderson's book was found in the possession of a descendant of Donald Swanson. And Swanson is supposed to have made notes in the margin of the book. And this is what Swanson wrote in the margins. After the suspect had been identified at the seaside home where he'd been sent by us with difficulty in order to subject him to identification, and he knew he was identified, on suspect's return to his brother's house in Whitechapel, he was watched by Police City CID by day and night. In a very short time, the suspect, with his hands tied behind his back, was sent to Stepney Workhouse, and then to Colony Hatch, where he died shortly afterwards. Kosminski was the suspect. Now, I know there are cynics out there that would say this is just not real. Donald Swanson did not make those margins. There's actually been studies on the handwriting, and also were different pens used when he named the suspect being Kosminski. Because this book was found in 1987. 1 year before the big 100-year anniversary of the Jack the Ripper crimes, and obviously more media attention was going to be done in that year. So this sort of got in ahead of the curve, the publicity curve, by releasing in 1987. So that people say that's a bit suspicious. Yet if it was a forgery, surely you'd get the details right. And there's a lot of details that don't stack up as regards Kosminski. But they might stack up with another bloke, Kaminski. So there was a Polish-Jewish immigrant of exact same age as Aaron Kosminski, Nathan Kaminski. Now, when he was at the asylum, he was probably known by the last name of Cohen. Because if you came from Eastern Europe and the person filling in your paperwork either didn't understand you, couldn't spell your name, didn't bother really get to know how to do so they would write down Cohen, and it just became a bit of a name that was given to these immigrants. Now, some people dispute that never ever happened, but actually there's absolute proof that this was going on in 1880s in London. And so, to not confuse anything though, and not to be disrespectful, but I will refer to Kaminski as Cohen from here on in so that we can clearly understand which person we are talking about. But let's look at what Swanson said to see if one or either could be matched to these details. Now, it said that he was identified at the seaside home, which seems really odd. Like, why would official police business be just done down at a seaside house? Like you've just gone for a walk down to the beach and you're getting someone to identify somebody. Well, the police had this particular fund for what was going to be known as the seaside home for retired police officers who maybe not been going so well. A bit of a convalescence home for them. Yet that hadn't been built in 1888. But that's not to say that they didn't already have some buildings for that purpose that they were already using that name for, which is definitely what happened here. But they're saying that they took what they believed was Jack the Ripper to be identified by the person who had a clear view of the perpetrator. And they say that person was Joseph Lewender. It's not definitely confirmed, but that is the general consensus. We will get back to Joseph Lewender. But it said that when he saw him, he said, yep, that's the bloke I saw. So now they've got him. Except the person will say Lewender for the sake of it, then says, I'm not going to court. I am not going to be responsible for sending one of my fellow followers of the faith, being Jewish, to the gallows. Not going to have that on my conscience. It's against what I believe. That does not pass the pub test for me. And for two reasons. Firstly, why would a Jewish person not send someone to the gallows and say it's because of their beliefs? When I believe in the Old Testament that they would follow as the eye for an eye, life for a life. You do the wrong thing, you pay the price. And giving false witness is a terrible crime. So I can't see why someone would do that. There could be a reason, though. So I will give this person the benefit of the doubt. But I cannot give the benefit of the doubt to Donald Swanson here. Because they'd hauled people off to the police station and had them locked up on numerous occasions. We've already mentioned John Pizer. But then there was a bloke called Piggott, a bloke called Puckridge. They'd all been taken off and held in prison. And those two blokes got let out after another crime happened. So they said, well, you couldn't have done them. But they actually could have done the crimes they were arrested for, which is an also interesting sideline. They arrested Alfred Blanchard. And they knew that he was innocent, but they kept him in prison for 3 days. So if you knew for sure that you had caught Jack the Ripper, would you not haul him off and hold him in the prison? You wouldn't just monitor him, surely. But the Jewish person doing the identification may have not wanted to commit because that would go against the whole idea of looking after one another and keeping that immigration door open, because if it became known that it was a Jewish person who is Jack the Ripper who had done this autumn of terror, well, yeah, the consequences for the Jewish community in the East End of London, I would suggest, would have been bad. So maybe that was his motive. But the police, even though they were concerned about anti-Semitism rising up, surely putting someone like this off the street was far more important than maybe quelling a couple of riots. But who am I to say? Yet, another statement that Swanson said is return to his brother's house. Well, that fits Kosminski, absolutely, because he had family, and family that cared about him. It doesn't fit Cohen because he had no family. So Swanson could not have been referring to Cohen in that instant. The next point Swanson said was that these suspects were watched day and night by the CID. Another police department said that they staked out a butcher's shop in Butcher's Row. Now, both operations could have been happening in parallel, but it makes no sense why the police would watch either Kosminski or Cohen. Because Kosminski was ending often on the street trying to eat bread out of the gutter, and Cohen was just as mad as a cut snake. Like, he would attack people just randomly. He was really losing his mind. Yet, there could be someone that they were watching who often falls into this Polish Jew theory, though he was a Londoner. He was born in London. He was Jewish, and that was Jacob Levy. There is a deeper dive coming into Jacob. Actually, it's Levy. I've been saying Levy, but I believe it's Levy is how it's pronounced over in England, so I'll now run with that pronunciation. But he had a butcher's shop, so it would make sense that they were watching him. And he also was losing his mind. But that is a pub test for another day. But just as very quickly, to give you whet your appetite for that one, if Joseph Lawender did accurately see the person with Catherine Eddowes the night of that double event, well, he said the perpetrator was 5'3", and then that would tie in very well with what happened in Hanbury Street a few weeks before, because the fence there was 5'6", and someone in the neighbouring yard didn't see anything, heard something, so whoever was in there would have had to have been shorter than 5'6", so it's said. But there's more detail to come on that. But I do find it interesting that Jacob Levy is often sort of pinned with this group as well, though he wasn't an immigrant. But moving on to the next point, Swanson says that the perpetrator was, with his hands tied behind his back, taken to the asylum, or at least the workhouse first. Now, interestingly, it was not that workhouse that he mentions in these margins, because the Stepney workhouse, apparently, it just wasn't there. It came in later. So he got that detail wrong, but that's probably not an important thing, particularly if you're writing 20 years after the event. But Kosminski was handed to the asylum by his family. They took him in there, not with his hands tied behind his back, with the police taking him there, But Cohen was, because as I mentioned, he had a kangaroo loose in the top paddock, this bloke, and so they had to pick him up, shackle him, and he was going to attack anybody. So they hauled him off to the asylum. So Cohen, in this instance, fits that description. Now, it's said that he died shortly after. Now, interestingly, Anderson didn't say that. He said he is caged in an asylum. So that's an interesting detail, but Swanson said that he died shortly after. So did McNaghten in his memo. But Kosminski actually lived to 1929. But Cohen, he did die shortly after in the asylum. But the thing is, there's still one more that we haven't even looked at yet. One more Polish-Jewish immigrant. And that's Double H, Chaim Hyams. Now, he ended up in an asylum after being on the loose during the Autumn of Terror. But people say it couldn't have been him because he had infirmities. He couldn't move one arm due to an accident, and he had a strange gait. Something was wrong with his knees, and he walked really, really funny, and so people just eliminate him immediately. And it's funny that, because when you think of Chaim Hyams, all the pictures we see were 20 years after the event, because he did not die quickly in the asylum. It took quite some time. And there is a picture, and he would have been in his mid-50s. And that's the impression people have. And even the drawings, the depictions of Chaim Hyams is this older bloke who was really like geriatric, trying to get around because he had no mobility. But the truth is different. He was only 35 during this Autumn of Terror, and it said he was very broad-shouldered and was super strong. So therefore, he could have committed these crimes. And once you've got a bit of a disability in an area, say you got one arm's not working, you know how to work that arm pretty well after a certain amount of time. And it would explain some of the knife attacks and how they were done with using just your one good hand. But there are issues with all four people mentioned here. Kosminski, Cohen, and Chaim Hyams were all starting to lose their marbles. They were struggling. Now, remembering the women on the street were very nervous about Polish Jewish immigrants because they thought they first pointed the finger at this leather apron, and the pictures in the papers of who the perpetrator could be all had that same Polish Jewish look and painted them as sinister, real sinister looking people. So these women would have been very guarded with these three individuals. So they may not have taken them to some of the locations where the bodies were found. Except for maybe Jacob Levy, because he was a Londoner. He was a business person and he also had money. So out of all of them, Levy may have been able to gain the trust of these women. But the one biggest issue I have myself is that most people will say that this was cold and calculated crimes. That you could say, some people say very organized, other people point saying a very disorganized killer, but regardless would have to have their wits about them to be able to get away. And also have the wits about them to know when to lie low, as the Ripper did for a certain amount of time. There's no way Cohen could have done that. Kosminski was walking the streets constantly. Chaim Hyams also was struggling mentally big time and may not have had that cognitive function to be able to do so as same as Jacob Levy. So none of them really fit the description. Yet in me saying that, I have also seen and read where experts, and I'm no expert, have made a strong case for Nathan Kosminski, saying that no, even though his mental faculties were starting to go, he would have had those lucid moments where he could have done the crimes, because they say that his was more of a schizophrenia as well as Kosminski too. But that's not what was stated back in those days, but then they really didn't know much about mental health back then. But then there's one final problem we are looking at. Why did they not come out and just name the suspect? Well, you would say, well, hang on, McNaghten did. But that was just in a personal memo, like just a one within the police department. It was not meant for public notification. Well, other people will say, well, Anderson did, but he never actually named anyone in his book. He just said it was a Polish Jewish person. Swanson did, but that was many years after the event, and that wasn't found for 100 years, and there is doubt whether or not Donald Swanson actually wrote those margins. But I will say this, out of all 5 that we've discussed, including Pizer, and we know he didn't do it, I actually find Kosminski the least likely. And I know some of you out there actually think he definitely is the Ripper. But I find it the least likely because it just didn't seem to be in his character. Even for the decades he lived in the mental asylums, only one recorded occasion was he ever shown to be violent at all. And that's when he held up a chair to try and attack some of the staff because he didn't want to have a shower. But all the other times he was the easiest bloke to get along with. So that's why I just can't see Aaron Kosminski as Jack the Ripper. But as always, I'm really interested in your thoughts on this particular topic. Let me know down in comments. And as always, your viewing and your sharing this content is greatly appreciated. And if you've noticed, the channel seems to be on still quite the big uptick at the moment. So thank you to all you new viewers who have jumped on board. But thank you very much to all you who have been around here for the last 18 months and seen the progression of this channel as it has grown to what it is now. And let's see where it'll take us in the next 18 months. Because this channel would not be what it is without many of you. So before I start getting emotional, give us a like, give us a subscribe. I'm Owen, you've been watching The Pub Test, and we'll see you on the next one.